Secret Hill by Zoe Young. Part 2. Shadow Whispers. All we have is time. It is the only continued sequence of existence that we base all manner of our lives around. Yet it plagues us and warps us. The past, the present, the future. We never really appreciate the time that we are given until it all becomes too late and time has simply passed us by and we are left solemn, in grief, desperately grasping on to those moments that have drifted off into the most distant of memories, always hoping the irreversible succession will be revoked before we are. Once Jeanette had cleaned herself and put on her nighttime wear, she took herself down to the living room, waltzing past the ladder's bloodied handprints, which peered at her as it perched against the wall. She turned to the kitchen to prepare dinner. It was late for her, so it would need to be a light supper only, or Darlene might not eat at all. One of the things Jeanette was most proud of in her kitchen was the investment she made in her fridge-freezer. It came in buttercup yellow, brand new, and was one of the American giants. It set her back nearly £1,000, which was a sickening amount of money compared to the cost of the items that was stored there. But it brought her the joy of ease, and she knew if Thomas was still around, he too would have appreciated the simplicity in their lives. Or so she had convinced herself. Inside the fridge, it was full of tubs of pre-cooked food, fresh vegetables, an array of dairy and herbs, and a bottom shelf filled with stacks of wrapped meat, their juices pooling into the drip tray below. With no time to make anything new, it felt fitting to take out one of the tubs of food to heat up, and tonight would have to be butternut squash soup with fresh coriander and a bread roll. She poured the soup into a pan and diced up the coriander. The bread needed only some butter, so she found herself staring out of her window onto the back garden as the soup gently heated in the background. As the lights in her kitchen were bright, she struggled to see what was beyond the reflection. It was then when she realized Darlene was not in the living room behind her. The clock on the wall read 8:13 p.m., which was far too late for her daughter to be out. As the dining table was next to the living room, she picked up the bread, plates, and cutlery and headed towards it, hoping maybe she would make herself known to her daughter by her movements. But she did not. The house was still, with only a faint bubbling of the soup echoing in the background. Darlene had not touched the toy box from earlier, leaving no trace for Jeanette to follow. Jeanette wondered if this meant that she had heard what had happened within the attic. Turning off the stove, Jeanette squinted through the window into her back garden, hoping something might reveal itself. Although it was dark and the mist had thickened, the outline of what appeared to be Darlene was moving slightly on the patio. She stayed still, but her arms had found something interesting to do. Jeanette opened the back door quietly to watch her daughter for a moment. Darlene had put on her winter coat and was hunched over, talking towards something by the overhanging trees in the alleyway. She was very clearly playing with something in her arms, and therefore Jeanette, in her robe and slippers, silently moved over to her daughter's side. The air was chilled but still, the freeze grasping only at her bare skin. Her daughter continued to play, only until she heard her mother's voice. "Darlene, dinner's ready." With that, she stopped talking, suddenly looked up towards the back fence, and then slowly towards her mother. "Hey, who are you talking to?" "No one," Darlene replied. Jeanette moved closer to the fence, the mist not quite hiding all there was to see. But there was nothing but the trees and falling leaves. Darlene quickly went back into the house to remove her coat and wash her hands. If there was anything Darlene did well, it was knowing what was expected of her at dinner time. Jeanette looked down to where her daughter had been playing. There were no toys, no rocks, or mud piles. There was, however, 2 worms and a slug with their insides opened up, spilling across the patio. Next to them, there was what looked to be 2 twigs that had been her child's surgical tools. Curiosity had mixed with Darlene's aversion to boredom. The 2 settled into their dining chairs with a small bowl of orange soup steaming in front of them. They always sat at the table politely and spooned their dinner with great care not to spill anything onto the table. After all, food should be ingested and not used for painting, as Jeanette's mother would have said. It was delightfully creamy, sweet, and if she detected rightly, the perfect blend of chili and nutmeg. Mother would be proud. Jeanette interrupted the silence. "I'm sorry dinner is late, Darla. I just got busy cleaning your room." "But it's done now. I'm sure you'll be pleased when you see it." Flashes of Shirley's bloodied corpse shakes Jeanette's mind. There's still a chance that Darlene is none the wiser to the previous incident. However, to be sure, the conversation must continue. "Darla, I want you to know that Mummy doesn't blame you. You know? For the clothes. I think there was an accident with some paint and Mummy forgot about it. I used some of the clothes to clean it up and forgot to put them away. They'll be washed tomorrow. Okay?" Darlene, who was used to her mother not knowing how to apologize, took this as confirmation that she did not need to fear any payment for her dirty room. However, she did understand that her issues at school were not going to be treated in the same manner, and therefore tilted her head down and kept to herself whilst her mother scolded her. Her words felt almost like the buzz of a fly, annoying and monotonous. "Darla, are you listening? Why did you do it?" Darlene stopped eating and placed her spoon by the side. She felt forced to respond. "He has the same name as Daddy." "Thomas. Of course." The difficulties of trying to explain her father's disappearance has been a continuous battle. Jeanette's head and heart was heavy. She looked visually tired at the sound of him. She was always adamant that his whereabouts was unknown, and the last thing she remembered was having an argument with him. Both the police and her friends questioned her on this, due to there simply being no evidence that he walked out on the family home, but she has no further information to provide. She hoped her adamant spirit brought her continuous innocence, because although she did what she could to search for him, she did lie. What she didn't reveal is that this memory ceased during the middle of that argument. She does not recall what happened after he screamed at her. In fact, she doesn't even remember what they were arguing about. All she knows is she woke up the next day on the sofa with the previous night's dinner still cold on the table and all of Thomas's belongings exactly where they should be. Oh, I understand that, darling. I do. I miss him too. But you cannot take your anger out on the other children. It's not their fault. They looked at each other with a long, solemn look, one that communicated agreement and understanding. Look, I'm going to take you to school tomorrow, Darla. It'll be a nice change. I'll surprise Mr. Hahn with an early visit. I'm sure he won't mind. Now, once you've finished eating, take yourself up ready for bed. I'll come and kiss you good night. The remainder of their meal was short-lived, and Darlene did exactly as told. She excused herself from the table, washed her face, brushed her teeth, and changed herself for bed. However, the late dinner had provided her more energy than she knew how to turn off, so Darlene lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling above her where she lay. A dark mark had appeared, a new addition to the room. From the corner, a shadow watched her. Jeanette was clearing up the kitchen from dinner when her body froze. A roaring intensity swelled within her, showing her pulsating veins and swollen eyes. The same black smoke as before puffed from her lungs. This time, Jeanette did not come around so easily, but she instead walked into the patio in her back garden, leaving the door wide open. The moon was barely visible in the mist, but she stayed still, with her arms to the sky, staring up to it. Her robe had fallen loose and opened, showing the light nightgown she was dressed in, which surely should have frozen Jeanette in the late night autumn chill, but she paid no notice to it. The shadow in the bedroom corner moved closer, and the figure became visible the nearer it got. Darlene noticed them, and instead of retreating with fear, she smiled, and together they watched the room. One of the things Darlene loved about the night was just how alive things could become, and not once did she feel threatened by the behavior of these beings. The light show was about to begin. It never bothered her when her mother did not come to say goodnight, because she would always have these visitors to bring her joy. Then swiftly, appearing as glowing orbs, the lights arrived and danced around, mimicking that of a flock of birds. Some were green, some were red, and occasionally there was some blue and white. They were fluorescent, and always stuck to their own colour grouping when they flew around the room, through doorways, walls, wardrobes. These magical orbs surrounded her, bringing forth a peaceful feeling of protection. She couldn't help but smile. Usually she would take this as a cue to settle down and sleep the perfect sleep. But tonight, she wanted to play with the dancing glitter. So she too got out of her bed and danced around the room. Outside, Jeanette began to find movement again. She came to from her hypnotic state and shivered, tying her nightgown back up, and hurried indoors. It was late, heading close to midnight. She couldn't recall where the time had gone, but she knew there was no time to continue wasting by worrying about it. There was still the issue of Shirley, but maybe that could wait a while. Jeanette turned off all the lighting in the rooms downstairs, then ensured the doors and windows were locked. This might be a sleepy town she lived in, but nothing could be determined as safe anymore. She moved herself up the stairs, noticing her daughter's room before heading into her own. It was more than likely that she was sleeping, but she told her that she would kiss her good night, and after today, it felt more prudent than before to follow up on what she said she would do. But as she entered the room, Darlene shuffled in a sharp breath and halted her movement. She was stood in the middle of a room. Jeanette had caught her doing a ballet movement, whilst following her gaze to something in the room. Jeanette flicked the light switch on. There was nothing else to be seen. Guilt and embarrassment oozed off her daughter. Her mouth jarred open with shock. Jeanette was riled up. How dare she be out of bed at this time, ignoring her direct instructions to get to bed? Jeanette's lips shivered. The hairs on her neck raised over a flood of goose-pimpled skin. Why would her daughter defy her like this? Her sweet baby, her darling Darlene. Darla, I asked you a question. Answer me! She slammed the palm of her hand against the doorframe, then shook out another shriek of her name. Her daughter, who was never as young or as juvenile as she would have you believe, drew out her answer, always knowing it was the painful tension she loved to taunt her mother with when she knew she'd overstepped her mark. The confidence she felt when her secret friends were around her might one day give her the strength to lash back out in the same aggressive manner. But for now, she was satisfied with taunting her. I wanted to dance, Mummy, she replied. She curled her mouth down and pushed out her bottom lip. Bold, sad eyes took shape between the silky twists of her hair. She would gaze upon her mother from her saddened, drooping head. Jeanette stretched out her arm, hoping to push back the locks of hair that trailed in front of her daughter's face. A tear trickled down her cheek as the tension eased. Darlene stared directly into her mother's eyes, shifting her head backwards. She wanted nobody to touch her. And it was in that moment, where fear, anger, and painful irritation possessed her to speak the unspeakable. Jeanette's eyes expanded, this time induced by her raging insanity at the devil child that was her daughter. How dare she speak to her like that? Jeanette screamed at Darlene. Hysterical. She spat. She gurned. Jeanette's hair stuck to her wet face. Snot dripped from her nose. Darlene knew how to get under her mother's skin, how to enrage the woman. So to add more to the fire, she swore once more. Jeanette eventually collected herself, pulled back her hair, and adjusted her gown. Where Darlene stood, the pink wallpaper peeled beside her, little trails left on the floor. Darlene began to pick at the wall as she did when she was alone and bored. "Don't do that," Jeanette said. Darlene continued to peel the wall while staring into her mother's eyes. "I said don't do that." Darlene looked towards the shadow that had recoiled to the corner of the room. "I'm not doing anything, Mummy." A smile twinges on her lips. She'd had enough of her mother's outbursts. Now was the time to strike back. Jeanette pulled back her hair and turned from the doorway to glare at her daughter before swiftly leaving. The shadowed figure rested its wisping arm onto Darlene's shoulder. The smoke brushing against her skin and stroking her face. From the hallway, footsteps clumped along the wooden floorboards, a hint to the beginnings of a miserable storm. Other than that, for Darlene, it was a ghostly kind of still. But she wondered, had she won? She had never won an argument with her mother before. Her confidence beamed, but before she could work out what was really happening, she caught the sound of running water. Her mother suddenly appeared before her. Jeanette rolled up her sleeves, snatched Darlene's arm and dragged her out of the bedroom and threw her into the bathroom. She fell to the floor where the cream plush bath mat cushioned the impact. Water surged from both taps. Jeanette stepped into the bathroom, the tiles cooling her bare feet. Only then did she realize her body was burning hot with rage. Her chest stung against her dressing gown. Sweat soaked her armpits, leaving her with an itch. "When a little girl like you is naughty, they have to be punished, or at least cleaned." At once she pulled on Darlene's arms, tugging wisps of hair in the process. "Mum!" she shrieked. "Don't!" Her lips trembled as Jeanette pulled her almost into the bathtub, trying desperately to push her under. And in she went, kicking out her legs, the tub not yet full enough for complete submersion. Darlene clamped her lips and eyes tightly shut. An assault of waves erupted as her mother fought to keep her daughter down. Jeanette let go with one of her hands to grasp the bottle of soap on the floor. The girl blasted through the water to gasp for breath. Darlene shook as her mother gripped her soaked nightdress, pinching the skin on her torso. The soap appeared, its lid ripped open by Jeanette's teeth. She squeezed the liquid over the girl's face, smothering her skin in sleek vanilla. It seeped into her mouth, the creamy perfume vandalizing her tongue. An assault of waves flooded over the edge. Jeanette slipped on the floor and pushed Darlene further into the tub. As she did so, she bit her own lip, the metallic tinge jolting her. She pulled herself away from her daughter and grabbed some tissue to wipe her face. So distracted as she was, she never noticed the stillness from her daughter. "Darla." Her heart thud louder. "Darla? Darla?" The water still poured out, although not as loud and disruptive as before. She grasped the taps, burning her hand on one of them, and eventually turned them off. She noticed the mess she'd created in her bathroom, the pretty cream bath mat, sodden. Luckily the bathroom was tiled, not carpeted like it used to be. The sweet green marble looked quite lovely under the water. It shimmered just right. She looked down to see her daughter's face and smile at her, but all she saw was blood. Jeanette went numb. Her daughter was supposed to be in there, not blood. She knelt upright, gazed into the water for a moment, then threw herself into the horrid red, attempting to pull out her daughter. Her precious daughter. As she pulled her dress, she grasped her arms, hauling the body out. She was much heavier than she was earlier. Tears welled in her eyes. "Baby? Darla? Darla?" Her poor Darlene was motionless, pale and motionless. "What have I done?" Her poor, sweet baby, her darling Darlene. After a fraught attempt to try and breathe air back into her daughter and punch her chest for a heartbeat, Jeanette raged and screamed, crying for hours until eventually she was too exhausted to cry anymore. She pulled herself down the stairs and collapsed onto the sofa. As she slept, her body contorted, her muscles frozen. A gush of black smoke wheezed out of her, her body ticking until every part of the blackness had released itself into a giant cloud above her. The smoke rose up, lifting itself through the floorboards, and made its way into the bathroom. It hovered above the motionless body of Darlene. The cloud circled the body until sunrise peeked its head, and on that note, melted into Darlene, which took some time, and it wasn't until the morning bustle outside that the whole process was complete. Darlene's eyes shot open. She seemed untouched by what had happened to her the previous night. She gazed towards the bathtub, and then at her reflection in the mirror before examining the cut on her head. It hadn't healed, but it had stopped oozing blood. She took herself to her bedroom, put her hair up into a high ponytail, and covered the wound with a bright pink, floral headband. Naturally, her hair was light, and so the blood had stained her hair into a much darker tone. But she liked this look, and if anybody questioned her on her recent change, she thought of excuses that might be believed. Darlene removed her soiled nightdress and washed off any of the blood on her skin, before dressing herself within a school uniform she had found neatly folded away in the chest of drawers. Her mother had always ensured there was plenty for her to change into. When Darlene felt suitably ready for school, she skipped down the stairs and found her mother. To her annoyance, she discovered her mother was not preparing breakfast like she normally would, but was in fact sleeping almost lifelessly on the sofa. And she calls her the messy one. Darlene stood over Jeanette, staring at her breathing softly. Her skin had paled to a ghostly white. Bloodstains smeared her face, and her hair was rough and thick with grease. A stench of body odour drifted off of her, providing the full illusion of a near-dead body. However, Jeanette roused herself from an alarming sensation hovering over her. She opened her eyes to see her daughter, changed, and glaring down at her. Jeanette screamed in horror, pulled herself up to the corner of her sofa, holding in her knees, a picture of dread and fear. She cried. Her mouth dribbled into her sleeve. Her daughter was there, before her, alive. She crawled off the sofa, hysterically sobbing, and cuddled her daughter's legs. Her body pressed into the floor. Darlene did not move, only inched slowly away where she could in order to remove herself from her mother's grasp, as though she was a king to a peasant.
"We're going to be late for school,"
Darlene muttered, and then walked off to the kitchen to grab herself a banana and a piece of bread. Jeanette watched in awe, following her by crawling on the floor. She'd converted to that of a being seemingly worthless. She looked around to her surroundings, at her clothes. Darlene, who was already tired of her mother's dramatic awakening, looked at her up and down with disgust on her face.
"You need to change if you're going to meet Mr. Hahn. I'll wait for you in the living room, but we need to leave in 10 minutes.
Jeanette, obedient and grateful, watched as her daughter stepped over her and placed herself onto the armchair to eat her breakfast, politely. Normally she would hate the mess of loose bread with no plate, but today none of that mattered. None of anything mattered. Her daughter was alive. She picked herself up off the floor, averting her eyes away from her daughter's, as she realized the state she was in really was disgusting, and she felt embarrassed by her daughter's judgment. If she had known the night she had just endured, she wouldn't be so judgmental, surely. None of this could be real. Did she dream it? Hallucinate it? What did that matter? She scurried up to the second floor to change her clothes, and noticed the soaked floor in the bathroom through the half-open door. It dawned on her. That room was going to reveal a lot of truth to her, but right now she didn't want to admit that. So she headed to her bedroom to change into something much more acceptable than she was currently in. It was then, when the pain in her head seared into her eye socket, the headaches that always plagued her decided to make another unwelcomed return. Using some spit and a tissue, Jeanette wiped away some of the blood stain on her face. Her hair was too matted to be able to brush through, and therefore she used an unusual approach and wore her woolen hat to disguise the state. Once she was ready, she rushed to go downstairs, but briefly paused for a moment as the ladder to her attic stood before her. Shirley. She'd forgotten about her friend. An intense nausea rumbled within. But now was not the time to dwell. She would deal with this later. She continued to rush down the stairs to see her daughter still sat in the armchair, but with the banana peel on the coffee table and the bread crumbling down her front. Surprisingly, the chaos of a messy breakfast didn't alarm her in the slightest. She was still crushed by the amazement of what was happening. They made it to the school as the gates were being closed, and picked up their pace to hurry off towards the classrooms. They made it, and Jeanette pulled her daughter gently by her shoulder to kiss her on the cheek before her teacher would beckon her in. Mr. Hahn was already in the hallway, reorganizing the children's notice board, but he wasn't stripped of his focus completely, because all the while he had watched the two of them enter the grounds and hurry to the classroom. When Jeanette watched her daughter through the glass on the classroom door, she saw the boy with tight red curls. She watched him, and noticed him inch his chair away as she sat down. With that, Jeanette's shoulders relaxed, and her head bowed down, but she wasn't sure if this was due to disappointment or relief. Things had reverted to what she knew. As usual, the rain had dusted them with a light sprinkle on their way, and so she unbuttoned her coat and took off her hat quickly to pull back her hair before ensuring it was firmly covering her matted lies. Mr. Hahn approached Jeanette with a bounce in his step. It was early morning, the start of a fresh day for him, with life all around. He enjoyed every moment he had with this school, and parent participation fulfilled his day. "Good morning, Miss White." Jeanette's face fell flat with dread. It would take only a few seconds for him to know there was something wrong. But he smiled, and continued to smile and discuss the beautiful work the children had put together yesterday, clueless of the blood quite literally on her hands. The walls in the hallway felt as damp as her attic, and smelt like it too. Shirley would soon change that to a stench more unpleasant than the last. "Is that okay with you?" Mr. Hahn asked, unaware that not for one moment did Jeanette listen to a word he had said. But given that she was there to view her daughter's work, she agreed that yes, whatever it was he wanted, she was fine with. "Oh, Mr. Hahn, I apologize I'm early. I didn't quite have the time to come later on. So we'll need to be quick. I have something I need to deal with when I get home." Mr. Hahn led Jeanette down the hallway into a large, open workroom at the back of the building. The room was filled with hanging coloured paintings, pegged across string pinned into each corner of the wall. There were pots of coloured pencils, paintbrushes, and boxes of rainbow paper on every side. Mr. Hahn opened a drawer at the far end of the room. It appeared to be a filing cabinet, each child labelling their own group of work. Mr. Hahn pulled out a stack that belonged to Darlene. He placed them on the centre of the table and fanned them out, ready to showcase them to Jeanette. The chairs in the room were too small for him to fit, not just because he was an adult, but he too was a larger man, and Jeanette found herself distracted, more to his belly peeking through his shirt as he perched himself on the corner table, than to the work that was there for her viewing. But she tried to remain focused. She noticed it was a mixture of creative art, not just drawings and paintings, but stories too. Her writing was large but precise. She felt a proudness to seeing her daughter's writing, and she couldn't remember the last time she paid attention to the formation of her words before. Homework was never that often, nor did she take the time to really help her daughter with it, so the growth in her education seemed a distant reality. Again, she hadn't listened to a word Mr. Hahn was saying about the art, the school, or how the children spend their time in the art room, but she knew vaguely he was trying to show off. She knew her daughter had a dark side to her. She knew that morbid curiosity inspired her to create train crashes and toy funerals. What was he going to show her that might embarrass her or concern her further? You know, she's a wonderful writer, and she uses great language for her age. Her imagination is vast, but we are worried. Jeanette's face moved to concern, her brow doubling over her eyelids. Most of the children write about their toys, fairies, or even about their friends. Darlene doesn't. The context of her stories are those you would see in adult fiction. Adult fiction? What does that even mean? Jeanette's eyes widened, her neck prickled. Could this mean... She doesn't even know what that means yet. Do you watch horror films, Miss White? Maybe not, Jeanette thought. Thankfully, she doesn't have to worry about inappropriate adult behaviour around her 7-year-old child. Jeanette shook her head. She was never that interested in horror films. Although, The Exorcist came out not too long ago, and for some wild reason the intrigue from the reviews had convinced her that she would like to go to the pictures for that. But she was unsure who, in this privileged, sheltered little Christian town of Bishop Burrows, would want to go and see a film about a demonic exorcism. This was something she would have to sneak off to on her own.
She writes horror, Miss White.
True.
Real horror. We generally try to encourage the children to explore the lighter things in life. As you can see, our butterfly wall there. Anyway, please take a look at this. This one's about a scientist who dismembers his patients, stealing their body parts. And this one? This one's about a housewife who murders her husband because he disagrees with her, and she throws him into a pit along with all the others who don't agree with her.
Mr. Hahn had a stern look in his eye as he gauged Jeanette's attention, and all the while she was experiencing flashbacks to the last conversation she ever had with Thomas.
Jeanette? Miss White? Do you know where she would get ideas like this from?
When backed into a corner, Jeanette was always prepared for a fight, but this she had to be careful with. Her daughter scared her, that was a fact. But now more than ever, not only was she just uncomfortable that she had a child that was unusual, she had a child that died last night, and now, for some reason, walked around like nothing had happened. It dawned on her. These images and writings before her was exactly what she needed to see to snap herself back into the reality of what was really going on. She celebrated that her child was here, with her, after what had to be the most sickening event she had ever experienced. She'd convinced herself it was her that was insane, not Darlene. But this couldn't be true. The dissected animals, the tortured dolls, countless of mucky clothes and rude behaviour. Darlene was the problem. There was something wrong with her. Jeanette knew it, and she was intent with ending it. At no point should she have dared blame herself for the problems caused by her daughter's father abandoning them. She took the work on the table and bundled them into a neat pile, then looked at Mr. Hahn intensely.
"Do you mind if I take these home?" she said.
Mr. Hahn put his hand up and nodded, giving all Jeanette needed as the go-ahead.
It's cruel what an abandoning father can do, Mr. Hahn. Thomas, Darlene's father, he disappeared and left us like a coward. What I see here is a desperate call for help, and I'll be damned if I let that man ruin our lives any more than he already has. His fear has plagued this family long enough. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Hahn. I'll see to it when she gets home."
Jeanette pulled herself together, buttoning up her coat and placing the work folded up into her handbag.
"He was the reason she was mean to the twins for their birthday. One of them shared his name. I trust you understand my mutual disappointment. But this is not her fault. This is not my fault. I'll get her to the doctors. Maybe we'll try church again. I trust this is a sufficient course of action for you."
Mr. Hahn eagerly agreed. He'd seen troubled children many times in his life, and action was what was needed.
"Mr. Hahn, I do not want to hear of any more concerns. I will deal with this. I can only apologize that Thomas has now impacted your life and the other children here at school. He's impacted us all. Coward. In fact, I may just homeschool her." "Very well, Miss White. But there is a process for that, and it's something that—"
Jeanette cut over Mr. Hahn with agreement.
"I shall contact the school with further information when I can. Have a good day, Mr. Hahn."
Jeanette smiled efficiently, tucked her legs together,
and nodded to Mr. Hahn as she let herself out of the classroom door. She paced towards the front entrance, keeping her head down so not to bring any attention to herself as she rushed past her daughter's classroom. But unknown to her, Darlene had spotted her in the glass, and the pace in which she walked. Getting home was a burst of relief. Jeanette's body had burned with adrenaline the moment she took hold of her daughter's work. Home. Rest. Peace. That was what it stood for, right? Not this which she was being tormented with every day. There was no peace. Not here. Not while her daughter roamed within these walls. She needed to take action. Change the blood within the walls. Or at least, paint over it. Shirley. Jeanette stood at the bottom of the stairs, glaring up to see part of the ladder from her position. She curved her eyes slightly and saw part of the open doorway to the bathroom. They both loomed over her. Each room a pit of horror. A dreadful darkness waited for her, to engorge on whatever light she had left within her. But first, tea. She swiftly moved to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and placed it onto the hob. As she awaited the steam to tell her it was time, she crunched on an apple, resting her back onto the sink. This time, watching the front door, and not out into the garden. It was unlikely that she would get visitors at this time, but it was still a possibility. Before her tea was brewed, Jeanette checked the locks on the front door. The last thing she needed was unannounced guests, as she clears up not one, but 2 crime scenes. Both which she still felt were not her fault. After a relaxing break in the armchair, Jeanette finally felt capable of dealing with the dreaded clean-up. A frightfully clean woman as she was, there was always plenty of bleach and utensils to hand. She rinsed out the bucket and sponge from yesterday's other incident, and collected cleaning supplies before heading straight to the bathroom. But going in was going to be an issue. She peered through the half-open door. The bathtub was at the far end. The shower curtain pulled from its pins, gently feathered across a pool of red. She looked to where her daughter had been laid. The horror, igniting a flood of tears from her stoned eyes. She did not move as they spilled down her cheeks. Something inside pinched at her chest. A heavy, swollen boil burned in her stomach. Guilt. Pain. Disaster. It was all true. A gust of air drafted the back of Jeanette's neck, releasing her from her inner turmoil. Guilt was not something she had to deal with often. This may have been the first time in years it truly burned at her core, but it was a short-lived experience easily snapped out of. She stuffed in a deep breath and proceeded to enter the bathroom. The tub gurgled as she released the drain. The red spiraling away. Once that was from her sight, it gave her the confidence that the rest of the day's troubles too would be that easy. To her surprise, it was. Or at least, clearing the bathroom was easy. The cream bath mat was really the only victim she had to dispose of, so she had collected it into a plastic bag and placed it along with the other blood-soaked items from Darlene's room. Cleaning always helped to clean Jeanette's soul. There was a bounce in her step every time she saw the satisfaction of good work laid before her. Instant gratification was for Jeanette to die for. Now, time for tea, and maybe some lunch. The kettle was on the stove and the bread was on the plate, quicker than her breath could catch up. The cooked pork made excellent sandwiches, but it always needed carving first because, as always for Jeanette, fresh was best. And after another rest on the armchair, crumbs on the plate, and cup empty, she threw her plate onto the side and left the cleaning up for later, again. She needed to stop doing this, but it made her feel special being this naughty when nobody could see her. Jeanette turned back up the stairs, but this time she was face to face with the ladder and the bloody handprints. This was going to be a lot harder to deal with. The burning heavy pit reared its head again, her eyes bulging, glazing over as she climbed up into the attic. This time, armed with a torch. The rocking chair gently danced in the cold breeze. Jeanette climbed to her feet. She had more confidence in her than last time. Shirley seemed almost like a stranger to Jeanette. She was now this entity that walked in on her life and ended up lost in the cruelest way. What had Darlene done to her? She knew she would have to remove the body, and for the time being it would be best within the shed, away from the wild animals and peering, nosy neighbours. Jeanette was not a strong woman, so she knew this would take everything she had in her, and it wasn't like she could ask for help. She grabbed an old dust sheet and placed it out onto the floor, hoping to move Shirley onto it. Her face was still pretty, even though it might have been cut. The swelling did change her, but it didn't take away the true essence of her features underneath. Jeanette knelt down and stroked her face. But as soon as she touched her skin, she felt the cold hardness that came with it after a certain period of death. Her body was changing. It was ceasing to be. It was in that moment the reality of her situation drained her body. The pain in her chest returned. She felt her insides breaking, shaking, and weighted into the floor. Her sweet friend. Her poor, sweet friend. But then, her memory returned, in pieces. Broken, tiny pieces. Oh no. Oh no. The denim jacket. She was in her house in that jacket, laughing. She smiled all the time. But that would mean it wasn't Darlene. She looked down at her hands, the memory of the knife grasped in it, swinging, lunging at her friend. Keep your hands busy. They lie to us. It was her. The pieces fit. She did it. Before she could move, the cover to the attic was placed back behind her. Jeanette screamed, then scampered over to the cover, watching the chair bounce harder, her heart pounding faster. The air around her chilled to an unbearable frozen stillness. Her breath wisped white puffs in front of her. The walls of the house creaked. The roof shook. And the floorboards cracked. Jeanette closed her eyes, wrapped her hands around her head, and screamed into her arms. Then, silence. The air returned to as it was, chilled, but not that of frozen death. The breeze continued, and the chair slowed down. Jeanette grabbed the torch and found the tag which pulled off the cover. The ladder was gone. Her mouth fell into her stomach, instant cramping in her heart and a sting in her neck. Somebody was here. Jeanette could feel her heart in her mouth, her veins pumping thick and fast. She tried to look as far as she could out into the hallway, without revealing her head to the air. She could hear them, whoever this was. The floorboards creaked slowly as they stepped down the stairs. Once they stopped, she waited. Minutes had passed by. They could be anywhere down there, waiting for her to return. Or did they not know she was there? She locked the front door, but not the back door. Her eyes shot wide. She knew she would have to take herself from the attic as quickly as possible. But she needed protection. All she had was the torch. It was a thick, red plastic, perfect for durability, but how much damage could it really impact? She looked down to the floor below her, but the sudden nausea at heights made an appearance. Feet first. She laid onto her stomach and lowered herself slowly through the hole. Her ankles leaning over, then her knees. Then she was as far as she could hold on to. And as she dangled through the ceiling, unable to see below her, she clamped shut her eyes and jumped. It was a loud creak into the floorboards, but she managed to save herself from creating more havoc by being wary of the wall behind her, ready to soften the blow, which thankfully it did. She pulled herself back against the wall and raised her torch beside her. Sweat dampened her head. Her hands shook. If she backed herself against the wall, she might be able to see downstairs and hopefully not be in full view of whoever is waiting. And she did as such. But before she looked, her final farewell played in her head. At least if somebody tried to kill her, they couldn't blame her for Shirley's body. She shifted her head further to the edge of the wall to look down the stairwell. She edged slowly closer until she managed to view the whole bottom of the stairway, to which there was nothing. No shadows. No sounds. No people in sight. She relaxed her posture from the wall. If she could crouch far enough, she might be able to see if the back door is open. She bent herself down to see further, but the door appeared to be shut. No additional lighting. Nothing. Balancing herself out, Jeanette put one hand, which clutched a hold of the torch, against the wall, and the other on the oak banister. She wanted to be as still as possible, as she eased her way downwards.
but her floorboards seemed destined to make her pay. Each movement of her ankle creeped out of her, precise and focused. The step made no sound, which in itself seemed to dry the sweat on her forehead. But then, Jeanette was flung down the stairs. She landed at the bottom 3 steps before rolling off towards the kitchen. Her head pounded, her ribs cracked and her ankles twisted, the burning tears searing into her like a great flaming poker fresh off the coals. She was dazed, but not confused. Her torch had left her hand, and with nothing to hold on to any more, she pulled her body as far as she could from the floor, raising her head to view who was at the top of the stairs. But there was nobody. Nothing. She screamed out in pain, not realizing her wrist too had hit the banister on her way down, so she pulled her arm into herself and turned to look around her. As she twisted her neck, there they were. The kitchen, standing in front of the cabinets. Darlene stood still, arms fixed to her side, glaring at her mother. "No, not now," Jeanette whispered. "Not now." Without turning her body, Darlene reached for the carving knife left on the kitchen counter and stepped towards Jeanette, trembling on the ground. Suddenly, Darlene froze. Her muscles contorted. Her eyes bulged out and she wheezed. A puff of black smoke blew out of her. She grinned, knife held high, and charged towards her mother. Bishop Burrows had been, for the ordinary folks who lived among it, an ordinary town. Life was mundane, but carefree. When they woke in the morning, the sun would always rise and breathe life onto them. The trees always flurried in the breeze, the lakes were always smudged in mist, and the earth was always damp and fertile. The events that took place within the White household, although shocking, did not distract the town from their surroundings. And just like those who visit the sleepy town of Bishop Burrows, they were all too distracted by the secrets beyond the hill than by the secrets that lay right beneath their feet. Jeanette laid on the floor, blood oozing from her body, whilst her eyes fixed upon the ceiling above her. The last 8 years of her life had been a mystery, but she knew she had been here before. Aware of the life draining from her, she remembered the cold, empty feeling as she struggled to move, to breathe, smile. Funnily enough, that was also the last time she ever really felt alive. And somehow, as she recreates the tragedy in poetic stance, she too felt alive now. The birth of her daughter nearly ended her, but something kept her alive, or someone. And then she remembered. The smoke, how it found her,
moments from the edge of death, and completed her. But somehow, she never returned from the edge. She stayed close, whilst also comforted that the smoke controlled what was left. It paused the inevitable. It distracted her with pleasance of the end. No responsibility, no feelings, just peace. How Jeanette had longed for peace. Her mother had tormented her and plagued her existence with evil. It turns out, her mother had created the perfect vessel for the smoke. There was just enough pain, rage, resentment. The smoke could feed, and she could rest hiding from the reality. And now, she too had created the perfect vessel within her daughter, an inheritance of sort. Tears glazed over her eyes. The lights emerged from the walls. They flurried around her, swishing and swaying. Blues, reds, purples and green, dancing rainbows, lighting up the room. And just like that, she smiled. The first smile that had graced her lips in such a long, enduring time. It took all of the energy left that she had to give, and eventually she slipped away to join the lights above.